Well, I don't know if you're aware. A famous criminal named Professor Doriarty has escaped from prison. He has seized a farm and captured all the animals. To fulfill his diabolical plan, he has actually cloned all the animals, and he has forced them to work for him. The only one who can help is Super Cow. That's right, I said it, Super Cow. That is the plot of the computer game called Super Cow that Alicia and Solomon, they love to play. Super Cow is a cow that wears a red cape and walks on her two hind legs. And as she goes throughout the levels, she battles her enemies by jumping upon them. She collects coin and milk along the way. And at the end of each level, Alicia and Solomon, they get a report on how well they did in this game. Frequently, Alicia and Solomon get 100%. That's what it says. You get 100%. And that's the great thing about computer games, aren't they? You can be perfect at them. You can get 100%. You can get 3 stars. You can do very well. You can be perfect. Wouldn't it be great if life was like a computer game? Especially our life of faith. Wouldn't it be great if we could get 100%? If we could just breeze through each day like a level on a computer game, with no difficulty, with no hardships, and in the end, that we would be assured that everything in our spiritual life is utter perfection. Wouldn't that be great? Has anybody experienced that? No. Because it's kind of the opposite, isn't it? So often in our life of faith, there is this inherent struggle that we get into. Although we have this internal desire to be as close to God as we possibly can, and to have Jesus in our life, sometimes it's a struggle to make that happen. And not only is it a struggle, but sometimes we may actually act in manners which completely contradict that heartfelt desire. Well, our reading from Romans gives voice to this very thing, this struggle that is inherent in each of our lives. And so I would like to invite you to pick up your pew Bibles and turn to Romans chapter 7. Now, as a disclaimer, just before we begin, I may inadvertently make you feel worse before I make you feel better. Okay? So just bear with me. We'll get to good news. But just keep that in mind as we go through. One of the things that I value most about the Bible is that it gives a voice to the struggles that we often face. We read about everyday struggles from everyday people trying to live faithfully in their everyday lives. And Romans 7 is a profound example of that. Our reading begins with this phrase, I don't understand what I do. For what I want to do, I do not do. And that which I hate, I do. Now, who here cannot relate to that? I think it's something that we all go through. And what Paul is talking about here is about living faithfully according to God's commands. And it goes way just beyond the 10 commandments, right? It's not just about do not murder, do not steal, but it covers everything from those actions to those eternal affections like lust and pride and envy and anger. And what Paul is saying is he really wants to live according to God's commands. He really wants to have his life dedicated to God in a real and authentic way and to live in a way which reflects who Jesus is and the importance that Jesus is in his life. But there's a problem. And the problem is Paul. The problem is himself. There's this famous story of G.K. Chesterton. And he submitted an essay to the London Times. The London Times, the paper, was running an essay contest. And they posed this question. What is wrong with the world today? And Chesterton's response was this. Dear sirs, I am sincerely G.K. Chesterton. It's a similar fashion. We can say that the struggle to live faithfully in the world, it's based on ourselves. You know, what's that old saying? We have met the enemy and the enemy is us. We get in the way. And it's not because we don't have the desire to live faithfully. It's not that, we don't authentically love God, but we get in the way based solely on our fallen nature. If you look at the beginning of verse 4, which we actually didn't read, Paul writes, "We know that the law is spiritual," and he's talking about it's perfect, it's good, it's emanating from God, it's divine, but we are unspiritual. And the Greek word that Paul uses is "of the flesh." That's what it should be translated as. It's a term that he uses to so often describe that part of ourselves which struggles with sin and struggles with temptations. And so because that's apparent in all of our lives, we echo with Paul, I want to do this, but I don't. And that which I don't want to do, I keep on doing. Do you hear the frustration? And do you hear kind of the powerlessness that's subtly expressed? If you continue on down to verse 20, Paul writes, "Now if I do what I do not want to do, it is no longer I who do it, but it is sin living in me that does it." It's essentially a recap of what he said in verse 17. And what Paul is doing, he's not kind of removing his own responsibility, he's actually owning it. He's saying that I don't do this. I'm a sinful person. I have sin in my life, and I can't be 100% to God. We don't like to talk about sin very much. But the fact of the matter is, for me, for Paul, for all of us, sin is a problem in our lives. And the struggle of our Christian life is that when we turn to Jesus and when we accept him as our Lord, our lives don't become flawlessly perfect. We don't all of a sudden become 100% great. We are 100% forgiven, and we have the assurance of salvation. We have the promise of God's undying and unyielding love for us, but we still get in the way. We still tell lies, even though God says, "Do not bear false witness against our neighbors." We still curse, even though God says, "Out of your mouth comes curses and praise. This should not be." We still covet, we still lust, we still have pride, we still have anger, and sometimes making our lives reflections of Jesus is the very last thing on our minds. The fundamental problem is sin. Now, sin here does not just mean wrong actions. It's not just a mistake. It's not just something that you should not do. Because if that was the case, then the problem would be very easy to see. It's like that episode of the classic show Hee Haw. Has anybody ever watched Hee Haw? Doc Campbell is confronted by a patient who comes in and declares to him that he's broken his arm in 2 places. And Doc replies, "Well, stay out of them places." If the issue for us was just that, sometimes we do something wrong, then the solution is don't do wrong things, right? That's kind of easy. Should be fairly simple. And if that were the case, then all of us are capable of getting 100%. But that's not the case, is it? When sin rears its ugly head, it begins to muck everything up, and we feel so often condemned and alone. And what Paul says is that it's this force of living in me. And that's what he means by the word sin. It's not about a mistake. It's not an action. He's calling it a force. It's a spiritual power that seems to dominate him. And because we live in a time where we are, awaiting the full realization of our redemption, we still exist in a time where sometimes we fall under sin's temptations and we wander away from God in our life. And so there's this inner turmoil. There's this inner struggle with our spiritual life of wanting to be true to God, but often falling short, and sometimes blatantly doing that which is contradictory to our desire. And so what Paul says in verse 22